honors. So I'm delighted to welcome Agustin Fuentes to the reading group this week. Agustin has been part of the multi-species conversation from the get-go. He had a fabulous essay in the original issue of Cultural Anthropology where we introduced the term multi-species ethnography, and that was drawing on some of his fieldwork amongst people and macaques and the ways that they interact in Bali, Indonesia. Agustin has done an impressive amount of fieldwork all over the place, from Singapore to Gibraltar, and has lately turned to thinking about the human condition, writing about everything from love and hope to this current piece about what it's like to be social in the pandemic. So Agustin, thank you for this paper. And maybe as just kind of an initial question to get it going, it'd be great if you could kind of situate this piece within your broader work. And also, you know, this idea of niche creation is a really interesting one. And, you know, I think like a lot of folks from sort of the Santa Cruz schools who I see on this call, like Astrid and Elaine, would be thinking the same sort of thoughts, but with the idea of worlding. And right. You know, here you have a deep literature in ecology and evolution for thinking about ways that critters, including humans, create worlds for themselves. And you know, you're in this piece describing how this virus gets around by, you know, taking advantage of something that's integral to who we are. You know, we're social creatures. So could you talk more about sociality and this idea of niche creation or worlding?
Yeah, thanks, Evan, and thanks everyone for showing up and reading and interacting. Yeah, I mean, so you know, I obviously draw heavily on the concepts of worlding or niche construction, but really, you know, an Uexkelian Umwelt, right? The idea that organisms map within and with and by the worlds in which they exist in, co-create, push against, and are shaped by. So if we tend to sort of think about humans as deeply social organisms living in co-ecologies that they mutually construct with one another and with a multitude of others within the dynamic, the baseline becomes incredibly messy and complicated, but very important. And the virus, right, SARS-CoV-2, gives us sort of an insight to disarticulate some of this and to think with it, right? So I think a lot of the work that I've been really interested in lately is sort of how humans navigate the sort of niches that they build and construct. And I'd argue that the human niche, all organisms overlap and construct niches, but the human niche is particularly interesting for a number of perspectives. Being an anthropologist, I'm very interested in sort of its evolution and structuring, but also particularly interested in how humans navigate it, shape it, and are shaped by it, right? And in this context, one might argue that sociality, as we can get into, is a central component of our physiological, ecological, and behavioral functioning. But at the same time, sociology is always a multi-species event, right? I mean, if you want to think about it, our human mode of sociality, just interacting with other humans, is also a sense of making our holobiont happy, right? That is, our health and wellness is this multi-species context. And so the lens of the coronavirus gives us a sort of way to map out some of those relations and contexts. So there's a lot I could say about it, but I'm much more interested in what people want to ask about.
Yeah, I like this idea, throwing in the holobiont as well. And you know, we're in this moment where, yeah, we're being forced to think about pathology because, you know, this thing gets inside of our cells. It makes breathing difficult, and it also creates intense anxiety about social encounters. You know, these fundamental parts of human life are now surrounded just by these cloudy ontologies and epistemologies, to go back to Celia Lowe's ideas that she introduced in that same volume in 2010. So how, maybe if you could just offer some personal stories too, like as you're thinking these thoughts and trying to navigate new modes of sociality, what sorts of new practices do you see emerging as you and others are negotiating kind of this tension between the desire for something that we need to do, hang out, but also this increased awareness of just mortality and contagion.
Well, I mean, it's always been there, right? That one of the things I think just that the fear has become more viscerally identifiable for a lot of folks. And I've been doing a lot of work lately on, and I'm doing a couple projects right now on how people are navigating, creating these social, sorry, my dog is going nuts out there. I don't know if you can hear it. How people are navigating these sort of social landscapes, right? And I think something that's really interesting is, for example, this kind of Zoom meeting, this kind of mode to be social with others and interact, creates, I think, opportunities and novel landscapes for us to push with and against, right? So we might be being social at a distance in physical senses, but we're actually spending a lot more time maybe even reshaping our neurobiologies via this two-dimensional interface mode. And so, I mean, one thing that I'll give you two examples. One is this sort of so much Zoom work or so much sort of screen time and engagement is really important for interactions and connections and for our work, right? Many people are sort of tied to this, not just because they want to be social, but because this is part of the sort of obligation they have in a market or a capitalist system. So I think that's very interesting. And one thing I've found is that I've become more innovative in my interaction with this screen and the camera and my positioning. And so I've started to think ergonomically and structurally about my position, not just me in this space, but me in this space as you're seeing me, and sort of how I can manipulate these different kinds of contexts. So my sense of space is shifting, right? And I think our sense of social space is starting to shift. The second thing is a little separate, and I would, back to a multi-species context, also my way of eating is shifting a little bit. And I think really interestingly, dietary patterns, people's cooking, everyone's losing their mind over making bread and a variety of other things, has sort of provided, I think, this window of opportunity for people to think on the microbiotic structures and processes. And I was lucky enough to participate in a big microbiome conference recently, thinking through how our dietary patterns and our sort of relationships with our microbiota are being restructured in this new landscape of how we shop, how we eat, how we cook. So I think there's two ways that are highly social, right? That are I think having interesting impacts on the way we are in the world.
So returning to some things that we were talking about last week with Astrid's paper, relating to new ways of thinking about sort of like there was systems theory that governed how we thought about organisms and ecosystems, and to take Lovelock, the Gaia hypothesis. I wonder what kinds of new idioms we might develop in this moment of dysbiosis. It's a moment of dysbiosis, not only because there's a virus that is getting inside of some people's cells and causing damage, but it's a dysbiosis on other levels too. So in thinking about these niches that are constructed, where does our thinking stand with relation to earlier ideas about homeostatic self-regulating systems, but also, the ways that life interacts, I guess, in contingent kinds of ways?
Well, I mean, I think I actually push back a little bit against homeostasis in this kind of argument, thinking about the sort of human niche, or the human, the anthromes, right, globally and locally. So what I've argued, and many have argued, sort of facilitated the emergence of COVID-19, right, this collaboration between humans and SARS-CoV-2, but largely because of this sort of anthropogenic engagement with the world. Rather than sort of some kind of homeostasis, I would argue that most anthromes, I'm just like the area where I am right now, is in a frequent dysbiosis caused by human sort of engagement and pushing and activity. And I would say that there's some, not homeostasis, but recalibrations going on around the world with lockdowns and without lockdowns, restructuring maybe some of the ways in which other organisms are being able to exploit areas or engage in areas that humans are frequently messing up. I'm I don't buy this rewilding or everything's coming back. It's all good that humans aren't there. But what I am noticing is that in many places, you've got new equilibria or new disequilibria of travel patterns, of light patterns, of noise patterns. And I'm seeing different organisms sort of fill in these gaps and spaces. And I think that's very interesting. And so from my own perspective, I'm just sort of thinking about how are the dynamics of these relationships shifting given the current COVID-19 reality for human societies, economies, and behavior. And downstream, as these things continue to shift, what are the roles of other organisms in that, in urban context, for example? We've seen some fascinating things going on with rodents in New York, right? Some radical shifts in behavior, some moving around. Here where I am, the fox and deer are doing very different kinds of things. I haven't lived in this spot, but talking to folks who are around here. And then I'm also wondering just about some of the sort of more fungal and microbial, the soils things with the light intensity and the growth patterns. How are those things going to change? And so I think there's some real opportunities to think big about some of these dynamics and changes. The problem is, you know, it's hard to sort of the prediction quality, right? What it's gonna be like in 2 weeks relative to right now. I don't know. And so setting up a study design for this is a little bit problematic.
Yeah, I think imagining any kinds of futures right now is so challenging, and that's in some ways like an exciting thing about the current moment. Returning to a paper that we read early in the pandemic by John Dupre and a colleague of his, Stefan Goodinger. Am I saying his last name right, John? They talk about, you know, at the same time, I think what you just said is so important, you know, thinking about these bigger picture assemblages and disruptive dynamics and processes. They're trying to get at viral agency at a molecular level and think about the virus not as a particle, but as a living process, as something that's part of processes on cellular levels involved in replication and those sorts of dynamics, but also something that interfaces with processes on other scales. So I thought, you know, there's kind of an opportunity to bring these scalar dimensions into conversation too.
Yeah, I think that's really important. It's something that's I've been very frustrated with a lot of the popular discourse on the virus itself, and that is everyone treats it, or not everyone, but in a broader sense, even in a lot of the biomedical literature and a lot of the science writing, they're treating the virus as if it exists by itself. Even when it's in the human, it's always about the virus and the human, or just the virus, or the virus does this. And we know that's just not true, right? That's not the way these systems work. And then there's this incredible complex ecology into which coronaviruses map, right? Both within the human body, but even outside in the aerosol dispersal. I mean, that's an incredible, the complexity of what else is being dispersed, right? What these fragment sizes are like, how sort of wind and temperature and HVAC systems all sort of cooperate and collaborate to reshape these possibility of the worlds of the virus. I think we're making a mistake, just like people's focus on the vaccine or focus on the bio of the virus as opposed to the eco of the virus, I think is problematic. And so I'm very interested in down the road what we're going to see a few years from now of the sort of the co-ecologies constructed by sort of the SARS-CoV-2 and its relationship to both internal and external processes of the human, right? Receptor cells, a variety of our human immune systems, how they're going to be co-shaping one another, and other viral agents, right? You know, this relationship between a variety of flus and the coronavirus, I think, is fascinating in sort of how they're going to be mutually sort of co-inhabiting space within and between human bodies. And there's a whole bunch of other things out there. My problem is the more I think about it, the more complicated and messy it gets, and I'm having trouble unpacking some of these things to disarticulate them to focus on just one, because I think that's part of our problem.
Yeah, the moment we're trying to think about all these complicated dynamics all at once, it gets really hard to, you know, what moments or events or molecular interactions do you focus on?
Well, that's why working on teams and groups, I mean, this is, if anything, the COVID-19 landscape reminds us that you need multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary engagement to even ask the most rudimentary questions about these things, because none of us have the knowledges required to sort of engage with this. And yet here's an opportunity, and we're still seeing the sort of biomedical end here, and the social theory end here, and then the historians up here. And I think it's unfortunate. This is begging for really cool transdisciplinary engagement.
Yeah, we've started to try to do that. So we've had virologists on here, we've had clinicians, we've had some veterinary zoologists. We're in dialogue with some bat experts, trying desperately to find a pangolin expert who will talk to us. But yeah, like this is sort of a long, sort of mutating transdisciplinary formation. One of the things I really like, and this goes back to our conversation with one of the virologists who gave the current bug its name, is your distinction between SARS-CoV-2 and the emergence of COVID-19. I think there's a lexical gloss that a lot of people make equating the disease with the virus. And one thing that I really like about this piece is that you're not doing that.
Right. And I mean, thinking more importantly, COVID-19 is not just the mortality and morbidity, right? It's not even just the disease. I think we really need to think about the systemic processes, the sort of ecotropes of COVID-19, right? It's a kind of worlding, right? I mean, you can't just talk about the effects on human bodies without thinking about the effects on human politics and economies, how this is restructuring, how we're interpreting history. Think about the sort of way in which people are talking about the flu pandemic of 1918 now, sort of that we've restructured through the lens of COVID-19, an entire historical process. And so I think there's a lot more going. It's a very rich area. And I think, as I think I pointed out this piece or another piece, my fear is that people are either focusing on the biology or focusing on some social or economic component. And I think if we do that, then when this resolves, however it resolves, we're going to be in worse shape for the next pandemic, and there will be another one. So, I think we either retool how we talk about these things, thinking, and that's why I like the term COVID-19, because it's like a landscape, a dynamic landscape of all of these processes. But you're right, most people just use that for, oh, infection by the virus and maybe the disease, or maybe both, or what have you.
I'm going to pause and see if anyone else wants to jump in here.
I had a question. You were starting to get at that. Thank you so much, Agustin, for being with us and for this wonderful paper. I like that portion of your piece in which you were writing about the deep historical tracing and talking about this not coming out of thin air, which I think is something that really pushes back on another very common pop culture kind of narrative swirling around, and that is randomness. This sort of random event and nothing to be done. So I was just wondering if you could really, you've already started extending it in the last few moments of your commentary, but say a little bit more about that kind of deep historical tracing that you're pointing towards.
So, I mean, I think, and this is, people have written ad nauseum about this, and I think it's really important, but it doesn't seem to get traction. That is, so, there's deep roots here, but let's just go back to 2002, right? 2002-04 with the SARS, and then the subsequent, about 8 years later, the MERS events. Look at what happened. It was 100, everyone who was involved in that. So at the time I was doing involved in a few projects correlated with SARS, and we thought, oh, wow, great. I mean, not great that it happened, but great. Look, now we have this transition mode. We found it. This is going to happen a bunch. And everyone got really interested in it, in understanding this particular sort of family of coronaviruses and their capacity for moving out. And so everything about COVID-19 was fully predictable, fully knowable, and in fact had been predicted and sort of planned for prior to it emerging. The only chance event, right, the only sort of random event here was which of the many tens of thousands or millions of transmission and mutation events was going to stick for whatever reason and move forward. And so I think this historical context is understanding what are the ecosystems that we've created, right, and that we are existing in, and what are those dynamics let us know about transmission and movement and spread events. And I think really the last, I think, you know, the 20th century is just event after event after event after event in these kinds of contexts, setting us up with this incredible database and incredible sort of plethora of specialists who research this stuff. And yet, here we are, you know, with this scenario where it was predictable, controllable, but in some sense, you know, data don't matter here at all, because it's not about the data. Understanding how this emerged and how it's transmitted has very little to do with COVID-19 in the sense of where we find ourselves today, right? I would argue there's other social, political, historical, and economic processes and patterns that have facilitated this kind of reality. So that probably wasn't an answer to your question, but it's this scaffolding, this sort of historical scaffolding, I think is really important if we're really interested in trying to mediate or ameliorate the potential impacts of the same kinds of things that are going to happen again and again in the future. I don't see a reduction in these kinds of events. I see an increase. And so understanding how to engage with them more effectively and sooner is critical.
Yeah, I think we could almost say there's, you know, this misplaced concreteness of the vaccine or of the medical treatment. And, you know, you name some of the things in here, you know, the creation of urban landscapes, industrial, agricultural, global economies. Each one of those is huge. And, you know, I'm thinking in part about, you know, this CRISPR book I just wrote, where it was easier to imagine this high-powered techno fix to HIV than in China imagining a social and political solution to the problem of living with disease stigma. And here it's a much bigger problem, and there's not only a single problem, there's nested chains of problems. And, you know, how do we begin, you know, especially in the current political moment where it's either, you know, a very conservative member of the Democratic Party versus this unpredictable, wacky orange person, you know, like the political and analytical and critical work that needs to be done within each of those things you identify: urban landscapes, industrial agriculture, global economies. It's huge.
But I mean, think about this in one way, in the context that you're describing, and this is, I think you could see this similar in many nations, but let's take the USA and the UK as a good example, where we're seeing a retrenchment in a very simplistic, particularly capitalist, particularly social Darwinian recreation, right? With this notion of herd immunity and this sort of whole idea that, like, okay, well, you know, the weak die, the strong survive. And it's really, I mean, it really looks like we're in the late 19th century. I mean, for many, if you listen to many of these arguments, it's like late 19th century arguments about how society should move and develop. And so I think there's a lot of complexity, but on the other hand, there's not, because we understand a lot of these systems and dynamics. There are many, many, many folks who are working on the ground, tracking and engaging with the COVID-19 landscape right now, who have good ideas and good plans and structures, but this larger sort of public discourse is being dominated by some really archaic and pretty dangerous, I think, fairly old motifs.
That very next paragraph in your piece, where you're also talking about human niche construction as it not only impacts on us, but you know, other species, and with the emergence of redirected rivers, filled in coastlines, expansive agricultural processes, you're chronicling how it's simultaneously creating changes in ecological, biological, social, political, and economic systems. I think one of the things that is escaping a lot of attention right now is all the other zoonotic pandemic diseases that are driving other species to the brink of extinction, and kind of the specificity of vulnerability in the current moment.
Well, or just think about SARS-CoV-2, and there's a recent very interesting article looking at the risks to other primates from SARS-CoV-2, and this really interesting, very surprising distribution of risk across different primate species. And it was published, basically, as a call to primatologists to think twice before going to do any of your studies or to go work in the fields, not just because of your interactions with other humans, but in fact, the potential risks for other primates. And so this is something that we've been thinking about now for a few decades, right? This sort of pathogen sharing across closely related species. But we can think of these cascades, right, in many ways that we're unaware of. And I think that people panicked when it looked like a few dogs and cats were getting at least the SARS-CoV-2 was making the jump to them. That didn't pan out in the way that a lot of people feared. But these kinds of relationships, we've been sharing pathogens and all sorts of microbiota, with others all the time. And we don't tend to think about that. We tend, even in this One Health motif, it's still focused on the human, right? When to understand the real ecology of these systems, we've got to have multiple species as sort of valid sources of our concern. And this primates paper was really interesting lately, but I think there's a lot of other organisms. One of the big concerns is, a concern on many levels, right? The sort of industrial meat processes around the globe, and what this pandemic, this sort of infection sort of cascade tells us about the possibilities for some of these. We've known this about avian flu and swine flu for a while, but there's a whole bunch of other things out there. And so again, I don't want to say wake up call, because this is all stuff that's already been known, but here we have an example, right? It is clearly showing us that things can get really bad really fast. And I think we need to think about that, not just in the sense of the human as the subject of risk.
Soraya, you've got a question?
Your question. Yeah, thank you, Agustin. This is very interesting, but I'm still a little puzzled. So it's clear so that the current crisis, let's see, makes us think about many things, and hopefully on the long run change some things. But on the short run, so what can we do on the short run? Because everything we have to change, like, agriculture, methods of agriculture, energy, traveling, I don't know what. So these are all long-term things, right? And even, stopping flying, or to a large extent and so on, hasn't solved the crisis, right? So what can we do on the short run? I mean, we all think the vaccine will not be the solution, right? As right. We are made to believe, but still, so on the short run. So what would you suggest, having this different picture of how all these things hinge together, and the long history of it and all of that? So what would you suggest on the short run governments can do, for instance, right? But oof.
Yeah. Well, governments can do an enormous amount, but they won't. So in most cases.
Short run. But I mean, it's short run, not long. I mean, I would make a difference maybe here.
Yeah, no. So I mean, there's sort of individual and sort of community and let's say national level changes. So I mean, what some significant, I think, very important components are for communities, or individuals and communities, to be very aware of the social and of each other. And I think sort of some things where I'm seeing food sharing, food banking, different ways of creating health and distributing health and wellness in local communities, I think is very important, because because in almost every nation around the world, we see incredible health inequity. And so reducing those inequities at a local scale has a broad scale, I think, benefit. Food banks, and other kinds of caretaking. At national levels, right, I think one of the critical things is education and health, right? So education systems, for in this case, education about COVID-19 and about SARS-CoV-2. I'm in the midst of a project right now looking at the United States public health information tasking. So looking at public health sites around at all the different states and at some major urban centers and research and federal centers and medical centers in the United States. You would not believe the diversity of what's available. So different states have radically different ways of conveying or not conveying knowledge. So some kind of uniformity and effective transmission of knowledge about the dangers, about transmission, about health, about these kinds of things. Simple things like that we would take for granted. I think those can go a very long way. So I would say health inequity at the community and broader levels, but also knowledge. sort of the distribution of consistent patterns. One of the biggest problems in the United States right now is that there is no cohesive narrative coming from any federal organizations in regards to safety. And that's, I mean, if you think about it, there's what, 370 million people in the United States. We're, what are we at, 10 million infected or something? To not have any coherent information process, and the same goes true for many other countries. Some countries have done a lot better. New Zealand, for example, has really done very effective. If you look at the mode of distribution of information has been remarkably effective, which is why one of the #1 Google searches in the United States now, I think, is citizenship for New Zealand.
Clara, you've got a question?
Yeah, hi, thank you so much for being here. So yeah, I had a question that goes back a lot to like this idea of scaffolding, but I think a lot of the infrastructures, both discursive and physical, that are articulating the response to COVID-19 right now are about either safety or avoiding viral risk. But I'm thinking alongside Tim Dean and barebacking in HIV/AIDS, but I was wondering if you thought that notions of risk, and particularly navigating a relationship to risk rather than recoiling from it, has a place in this political moment, and how could we make space for it?
I think that's incredibly important. And here, I think I want to push against the sort of the conceptualization of risk, right? Risk, fear, and avoidance. I think there's some real problems with that, because right now the risk modeling that's being done, that's the sort of traditional mode of risk modeling, actually it's not really risk modeling. It's a very specific sense of contagion avoidance, right? And fear of contagion. So there's actually multiple factors. And I would argue that the social, right, the need for the social doesn't override the contagion risk, but you need to keep multiple components in your risk analysis. And so one of the things, and this is where masks and a few other just different kinds of social distancing and structures. So I agree. I think we need to be very careful. It's not do not get infected at all costs. That's actually not the bottom line, because that is going to lead to an array of other associated dysbioses, to draw again on Eben's use of that term, and dysfunctions. And so we need to think about sort of what are the priorities here? What is it about being in community as a human that is necessary in this COVID-19 landscape? Contagion and transmission of the virus is important, but it's only one of many, 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 many processes. And so while I don't advocate at all, large risky transmission gatherings, I think there's a much broader range of patterns and processes of interaction that are incredibly beneficial that aren't amenable to the same kind of just contagion risk modeling. And so I think we need to move away from contagion. And a lot of people have been writing about this. And from the very get-go, one of the arguments was contagion risk is actually not the most important infrastructure to examine in most cases.
And Clara and others, we did have a discussion of Tim Dean's work on limited intimacy a while back, and actually Caitlin's work is also exploring those similar sorts of issues. We've got videos now of all the past reading group discussions online, and I put the link in the chat. I'm realizing that Tim's is one of the only ones we didn't actually record. So, but we do have the video from Caitlin's that is exploring, just what living socially with a virus might mean, and more creative answers to that question.
So I see there's a question there in the chat from Francisco, right?
Yeah.
Paco, you have that. That's a really interesting, complicated question.
Go ahead, Francisco.
But...
Yeah, thank you, Agustin, and thank you all. Actually, from before, I had this question for you, Agustin, about metaphorical versus material in human-ish construction, or your own conception of it. I don't know if you could tell us something about it, and also listening to what Soraya was saying, considering her own work, and when you were commenting about the fact that the way in which COVID-19 is being understood doesn't really go along the lines of current evolutionary theorizing about holobionts and ecosystems in the way it is by people like Kevin Leyland and others, right, who are developing the extended evolutionary synthesis and other topics that you are also involved in. So do you think that there is a responsibility from those communities related to molecular biology and bioinformatics for the way we actually metaphorize all of these processes? So there is, I think, a connection between both questions.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thanks, Francisco. No, I think it's very interesting. The first, I think, very importantly, and this is something that I've been pushing along with a number of other scholars, and this is this idea of the human niche in the extended evolutionary synthesis, right? To sort of think about niche construction theory as a process and a pattern, but to do so and to recognize that the human niche is not only material, right? The human niche is perceptual, experiential, imaginary, right? That all of those things are real is part of the process of the human niche, because those perceptual, imagined, experiential facets go into the ways in which humans navigate, push against, and are pushed by the world. So I absolutely agree that to stop at to do a traditional ecological assessment that uses only material observable and material measurable components to understand the human niche is erroneous and will not succeed, right? Because the perceptual, you know, for humans, perceptions, hopes, and dreams are as important as genes, bones, and muscles in an evolutionary model. So but that then relates to this, are we modeling this right? And if I understand your question, I'd say no. This reductionist mode of engaging SARS-CoV-2 or even mapping COVID-19 processes and patterns is problematic, because we need to simultaneously think about sort of traditional ecological, behavioral ecological, and epidemiological approaches and meld those with perceptual engagements with the kinds of ways in which people are interpreting this landscape. And I think those are both equally important, right? So the demographic epidemiology is important, but as important is the way in which people are perceiving of that reality and that experience, because that's shaping, I think, the actual demographic processes and patterns that the epidemiologists are interested in. And so I think one of my critiques recently of a lot of my colleagues talking about cultural evolution and sort of human evolutionary processes is that they continue to think that it's about bones and genes and muscles primarily, and the other stuff is a layer on top of that, and that's simply not true.
Exactly, thank you. Yeah, that was going to be my comment after what you have said, that probably we should rethink cultural evolutionary theory in the face of what's going on. Thank you very much.
And this, I mean, this is an opportunity, right? To think about all of these dynamics and to develop, if you're really into modeling, this is a great opportunity to try to come up with models that are much more dynamic. We have, you know, some of the technology. There are like some really interesting, I'm working with some folks trying to do new modes of network modeling. And what's interesting is a lot of people are being drawn to it now because of this two-dimensional interface, because we're getting more and more digital, trying to sort of reimagine some of these informations. What I wish we had though now is we need holograms really to even get started on this. 2 dimensions is not enough, 3 dimensions is not enough. We need 4-dimensional modeling.
Elaine, I see you've got a question in the chat.
Yeah, it's perfect timing also because of what you just said, Agustin. So thank you for that. I mean, it's actually a question about how we model. I would say actually that we're not even doing a good job at 2-dimensional, right? Like our 2-dimensional is pretty crappy. And so I'm actually nervous to go into holography when we can't even get 2-dimensional right. We can't even get XY axis right. So I guess, you know, I work on agriculture and lately have been thinking a lot about the push to big data. And, you know, there are several kinds of models, but it seems to me that they're very disconnected, right? You know, so you have certain data sources that can tell you about weather, you have other data sources that can tell you about yield. but they're very often conflicting. They need to be able to predict certain things. So the STS question or the feminist question of for whom, by whom, are really important. But I guess my question is about if we are going to think about pandemics, many of the arguments about what we as, I guess, different social groups are going to do about it are dependent on charts, are dependent on numbers, are dependent on being able to quantify based on, certain metrics that are set by governments or by medical officials. And so I'm thinking, and also largely confused, which is why I'm asking the question, how might we as theorists and analysts propose other units of analysis that can do some of the work towards arguing for health or ability in a different way that doesn't lock us into existing metrics, which are, incredibly violent and go back to French colonialism and their fetish of numbers and all that. Yeah, so I wonder, since you're thinking about models, I'm just, I'm kind of grappling with this right now, because in agriculture, there's a push to big data platforms and there are conversations around ontologies, right? So they're not clueless about these conversations. It's just that it has to boil down into zeros and ones, and that means we have to be able to quantify. And I'm not saying that quantification is wrong per se. I'm just saying, how do we, build complexity into, some of the things.
I mean, that's a great question. It's funny. It's something that I'm thinking a lot about lately. And I'll just say I'm going to try to answer that, but I'm going to draw it there, right?
Thank you, Evan.
Here, there's so many good scholars out there right now. I'm going to highlight, I think, a nod to Ruha Benjamin and her work right now on sort of algorithms and the sort of racist and racializing processes, because that's, I think, a great way to think through this, and it's very clear and engaging. But there's a lot of scholars out there really pushing against this whole our AI fetish, right? This idea that algorithms are the saviors, right? And I think what you talked about, quantification, we need to rethink quantification, right? And this is why I've had a long investment in agent-based modeling. Not that it's better, but that this idea that models should reflect decisions, fuzzy edges, and emergent properties rather than quantified bounded entities and fixed outcomes, right? I think if, especially if we're talking about sort of viral landscapes and the relationships to human sort of ecosystems and processes, the idea that we have fixed outcomes or that we can really cut these edges clearly and identify them in cleanly quantifiable metrics is just untrue, right? And I mean, the same with agriculture, right? I mean, you can talk about yield, right? But yield, right, is connected to so many other things that are not clearly metrically, that are neither analog nor digital, right? They have there's a much fuzzier reality. So let's take the COVID context. What should we be modeling, right? Obviously, we need to model all of the critical sort of viral processes and patterns and loads, but those models have to incorporate demographic realities, right? And also in those demographic realities, when you think of the dynamics that structure the data themselves. And I think here's where I would argue one of the biggest places we need to work. How are the data structured? So when you think about population genetics models and the ways in which the GWAS, the sort of large genome-wide assessment surveys go, one of the biggest problems is we know that all human populations are structured by historical, economic, political, geospatial contexts. And so the data we have are actually being the way they are because of internal structuring and dynamics. And one of the things that most models don't do is they take the numeric assessment of data, the quantitative assessment, at face value. Well, here's the quantitative assessment without recognizing that that quantitative reality is developed through a dynamic structuring of the elements of the populations themselves. So that's a little bit of a deep dive. But I think what's really important is we need to, I think this COVID-19 is asking us to question this kind of numbers first to design models approach, right? I think we need to think about the relationalities inherent in the systems and try to model those, and then figure out how the quantitative bits get filled into those relationalities. I think fuzzy edges of models are going to get us a lot further than sharp corners.
Cesar, you also have a question in the chat?
Thank you so much, Agustin. I really enjoy your work very much. It's kind of continuing with Francisco's intervention. So when you translate from biology and ecology, and you take the niche construction and you take it to the human side, you kind of show, okay, if we take it like it's taken in ecology, it would be cutting it short because we are not taking into account the whole background. But then my thing is, if we take into account that it's short there when we know it's short, why don't we question it back in biology and in ecology? And what would it mean to question it? What do you do with it? Or how does it change the way we understand biology? How do we approach biology from that?
Well, I mean, that again is a very long, deeply philosophical question, but a really important one, right? Because I think there's a number of scholars for a few centuries that have been pushing back against these sort of modes of engagement. And here I want to draw on Kinji Imanishi, the incredible Japanese founder of Japanese sort of primatology, ecology, anthropology, a number of different things. He wrote in 1942 a book called The Japanese Way of Being, only translated into English recently and in a few other languages. But his push against, he was lambasted for being anti-Darwinian. When he was not anti-Darwinian, he just pointed out that Darwin relied so heavily in his models on captive breeders that he overemphasized the structured nature of ecosystems, right? And really, Imanishi talks about flows, right? And pathways and rivulets and sort of boundaries that never actually form as boundaries and that merge and flow with one another. And I think if you look at what's going on in mainstream ecology right now, and actually in molecular biology in some ways, we're finding again that this sort of approach might be beneficial. The problem is we have this fear, right, of fuzziness in these arenas, when in fact, anyone who's done molecular work knows that, that bounded entities, cell membranes, come on, that the whole point of the cell membrane is to do stuff back and forth across it. It's a dynamic landscape of exchange, not a wall, right? And so I could bring it all the way back to our initial discussion of politics and whatever. The idea that there are walls and structures that we're built of is basically the wrong metaphor. So I would argue, yeah, we should be really rethinking, as many are, sort of these biological systems. And again, the sort of, whether you agree or not with it, the holobiont perspective at least forces you to question this notion of boundaries and entities, and think more of these sort of relations as the normative molecular processes, as opposed to bounded entities sort of coming into contact.
Thank you so much.
I'm glad you came back to the holobiont, because that's exactly where I was about to go again. And I was just spending time with Haraway's classic Promises of Monsters, and thinking about her theorization of symbiosis in the context of ACT UP and early AIDS activism, where symbiosis is not only about human relationship with a virus, but these entanglements between activists and lawyers and pharmaceutical companies, legal apparatuses. So I guess as you rethink the holobiont in the era of SARS-CoV-2, could you tell us a little bit more about those fuzzy boundaries? And it seems like there's a certain sort of stability or stasis or there-ness of an organism plus environment, and evolutionary theory has long tried to grapple with kind of stasis and change.
Right.
Ecology and evolution are all about that. So how, as you're thinking about these human-built niches with their architectures and reworldings, like how does the figure the holobiont change as these other agents are entering in and doing the work of disturbance?
I mean, think of the holobiont as this dynamic entity, not as just this individual, right? And so when we talk about the human niche, we talk about human architecture and structures. That's part of a larger process, right? That's part of ecology. This is our ecology, right? This is the ecosystem. And so I would argue that the social, right, and the material, the physical and the experiential are sort of dynamic components of that niche, right? And so it's not like humans construct and then we inhabit, right? No, we construct and are constructed by, and the we is, I would argue, is the holobiont. But we could talk about the holobiont in the microbial sense, right? But we can also talk about this kind of, what is the human? When I'm by myself sitting here in my room, even when I'm not staring at a Zoom screen, I am always actually interacting with others, right? The resting state of the sort of neurocognitive system, right? Our brain's resting state is the same as the social default state, right? We are in interaction all the time. And so I think pushing against this idea of like the gene environment interaction, that is the sort of this classic basis of our organism environment interactions, classic basis of evolutionary theory or ecology, is problematic because neither of those are distinctive entities in the sense of the longue durée of evolutionary and ecological processes, right? You know, just right now in this moment, I'm shedding stuff, I'm spitting, my skin cells are flushing off, all sorts of things are going on. And if we take that sort of notion, right, and I'm talking to you around the world, sharing information, taking this perception and particular, you know, chunks of thought and throwing them around just like my spittle. I really think we need to sort of, as many of, you know, many scholars are already doing, open ourselves up to this dynamic and figure out how to take back, I would argue, I mean, I like the science of it. I think there are ways to model and to think with this without chopping off the fuzziness or the mess or the possibility of unknowing while we're even asking questions. So I think the holobiont, if you get right what Roughgarden and others, you know, are really talking about with the holobiont, you don't have to agree with it, but it's a tool or a mode to help sort of think more broadly about ecological and evolutionary processes.
I think that's a brilliant, poetic, and insightful moment to end on. So thank you so much, Agustin. This was a real delight to engage with your work. Again, there's a number of books that are out on a broad range of topics, from creativity to love to, you know, what it means to be human in an era of racism and discrimination. So it's a real pleasure to think with you. And yeah, my only regret is that we all can't be social together in a physical way. And it's this 2D Zoom fatigue that we're all experiencing.
That's okay. Our hypothalami are being reshaped to make this as we speak.
So next week I'll be sharing parts of the book that Elaine held up earlier. It's about this world first CRISPR project. Agustin is also was an early reader of the book, and I'm indebted to you both. And I think I'll probably do the last. Oh wow, here comes a lot of people with. I think I'll probably do the last. So when Caitlin's work was discussed a couple of weeks ago, I mentioned that we might do the chapter on the really intense medical inequality that's emerging with the first gene therapies that are being approved. I think I'll put that on the recommended reading, but also point you all towards the last chapter, which is an extended discussion of Donna Haraway's work. And it approaches that question that we were just interrogating with Agustin. What does symbiosis look like in a landscape that's you know, really complicated and that has been created by humans? So thanks again. It's really great to see so many faces. Like we're strong, you know, this is a big group and we're doing it every week. So thank you for sharing the pandemic with me, and we'll see you all again soon.
Adios.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Agustin.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Keep me in the loop too. I want to start coming back in to these.
Yeah, we'll put you on the
Put me on the list.
on the email list. And yeah, I've dreams of coming up to Princeton for a visit, but yeah, who knows? Like dreams, the horizons of dreaming are really complicated, right?
Yeah, but don't